Maya craved silence the way others craved validation. As a freelance audio editor, her world was built on sonic nuance, the subtle architecture of sound waves. This sprawling loft in the Foundry, a hulking brick and iron relic of the industrial age reborn as apartments, promised sanctuary. Its legendary thick walls whispered tales of perfect isolation, a haven where the city's cacophony would die, allowing her meticulous work to breathe. She envisioned long nights immersed in Foley tracks and dialogue cleanup, cocooned in blissful quiet. The exposed brick, soaring ceilings, and vast factory windows were a bonus, an aesthetic echo of the building's robust history, now meant to shield her fragile focus. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The scent of old brick dust and new paint mingled in the cavernous space as Maya unpacked the last of her audio equipment. Her monitors, preamps, and digital audio workstation settled onto a heavy wooden desk positioned against the loft's longest, most imposing brick wall, a relic of the original Foundry structure. Sunlight streamed through the towering arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent performers. This was it. The perfect workspace, the ultimate escape. Her previous apartment, plagued by thin walls and inconsiderate neighbors, felt like a distant, noisy nightmare. Here, the silence was profound, almost physically present. She spent the first week settling into a rhythm. Mornings were for client communication and project organization. Afternoons and evenings bled into nights dedicated to the intricate dance of editing. She learned the building's subtle language, the low groan of the ancient elevator, the distant sigh of pipes settling, the occasional muffled footfall from the floor above, sounds swallowed and softened by the sheer mass of the walls. She reveled in the acoustic deadness near certain corners, perfect for test recordings. Minor quirks surfaced, a persistent cool draft near the base of the main brick wall, an odd resonance in the hallway that made footsteps briefly echo unnaturally, but she easily dismissed them. Old buildings had character, personality. These were just its settling breaths. Her work demanded intense concentration. One night, deep past midnight, she was meticulously scrubbing distortion from a crucial line of dialogue in a podcast interview. Headphones clamped over her ears, she leaned close to the monitors, eyes tracing the waveform, fingers poised over the keyboard. The city outside was a muted hum, the loft itself profoundly still. Then, it hit her. Not a sound, not a movement, but a feeling. It was sharp, focused, and undeniably directional. Like the heat of a focused beam of light, but psychic, pressing against the back of her neck and right shoulder blade. It wasn't coming from the windows across the room, nor from the doorway. It emanated directly, intensely, from the vast expanse of weathered brick just inches behind her chair. The sensation was one of pure, unwavering observation. Unseen eyes, boring into her from within the wall. Maya ripped off her headphones, spinning around so fast her chair screeched on the polished concrete floor. Her heart hammered against her ribs. There was nothing. Just the familiar texture of the bricks, the play of faint light and deep shadow cast by her desk lamp. No peephole, no crack, no vent. Just solid, impenetrable wall. She stood, breathing heavily, scanning the surface. The feeling lingered for a moment, a phantom pressure, then slowly, reluctantly, began to fade as she moved away from the desk, towards the center of the room. "Okay, Maya," she murmured, rubbing her temples. "Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. Stress. Fatigue. The classic culprits." Maybe the low-frequency hum from her extensive equipment setup was playing tricks on her senses. She'd read about infrasound causing feelings of unease, even paranoia. She tried to shake it off, walked to the kitchen alcove, poured a glass of water. The loft felt vast and suddenly less welcoming. Returning to her desk felt wrong. She finished her water standing by the window, looking out at the distant, indifferent city lights. Work was impossible now. The silence she'd craved suddenly felt charged, expectant. The next day, determined to reclaim her sanctuary, she rearranged her workspace. She shifted the desk perpendicular to the wall, facing the windows. For a few hours, it seemed to work. She immersed herself in a complex sound design project, layering effects, building atmosphere. Then, needing to reference a previous file, she turned slightly, her side now facing the wall where her desk had been. Instantly, the feeling returned. Weaker, perhaps, because her attention wasn't fully on it, but undeniably there. A cold prickle along her arm, the distinct mental static of being watched. Not judged, not malevolent, just intensely observed. It was as if something embedded within the very structure possessed a passive, focused awareness directed solely at her presence near that section. She quickly turned back to her monitors, forcing her focus onto the glowing screen, but the phantom gaze lingered at the edge of her perception, a silent, unwelcome companion in her soundproof sanctuary. The thick walls, meant to keep the world out, suddenly felt like they might be holding something in. The feeling didn't go away. It became a quiet, persistent undercurrent to Maya's life in the loft. And it wasn't random. Over the following weeks, she began to map its contours, its strange geography. The sensation was strongest, almost physically palpable, in specific zones, hot spots. She started calling them in her mind. The primary one remained the large section of original brick wall near her initial desk placement. Another emerged on the opposite wall, a section of thick, older plaster near a sealed-off chimney breast. A third, fainter but still distinct, materialized along a partition wall separating the main living area from her bedroom, specifically near the corner closest to the exterior wall. The feeling itself remained consistent, silent, focused attention. It wasn't like a human gaze, scanning or reacting with overt emotion. It was more like the unwavering focus of a camera lens left permanently open, or the passive awareness of something deeply embedded, simply registering her proximity. Sometimes, standing directly in a hot spot, it felt like a subtle pressure against her skin, a static charge in the air that raised the hairs on her arms, or a peculiar cognitive weight, as if her own thoughts were being subtly perceived. Driven by a need for concrete answers, Maya turned her professional tools towards the walls themselves. She unplugged all her equipment, sat in absolute silence, pressing high-fidelity microphones against the brick and plaster in the hot spots. She recorded hours of audio. Playback revealed nothing beyond the expected, the faint gurgle of water in distant pipes, the low thrum of the building's HVAC system filtering through the structure, the occasional muffled bump from neighbors that sounded miles away. Profound silence dominated the recordings taken directly from the hotspots themselves. Next, she borrowed a thermal imaging camera. The results were perplexing. The hotspots consistently showed up as colder zones on the display. Not dramatically frigid, but noticeably cooler than the surrounding wall surfaces. These cold spots weren't uniform, they shifted slightly in shape and intensity from day to day, sometimes correlating perfectly with where the feeling was strongest, other times slightly offset. It made no structural sense. There were no exterior drafts or plumbing lines in those specific locations that could explain the persistent coolness. Finally, she bought a cheap EMF meter online. Walking it slowly along the walls, she registered erratic, low-level spikes precisely within the cold, watched areas. The readings fluctuated wildly, never reaching levels considered dangerous or even unusual for an old building packed with wiring, but they were consistently different in the hot spots. Spiky, unpredictable bursts of low-level electromagnetic energy, correlating with the cold and the unseen gaze. It was data, yes, but it explained nothing definitively. It only deepened the mystery. One evening, during their weekly video call, Maya couldn't hold it in anymore. "Ben," she began hesitantly, tracing patterns on her desk, "this place. It's got this weird feeling." Ben's face, pixelated but familiar on her screen, shifted from collegial interest to concern. "Weird how? Noisy neighbors? Bad plumbing?" "No, nothing like that. It's the walls. Certain parts of the walls." She struggled to articulate it. "It feels like I'm being watched. Intensely. But silently. From inside the wall." Ben listened patiently, his expression becoming thoughtful. "Okay," he said slowly. "Old buildings can do weird things, Maya. You know about infrasound, right? Low-frequency noise from ventilation systems, traffic, even wind hitting the structure in a certain way? It's below hearing range, but it can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, even the sense of a presence. Your loft, being a converted industrial space, probably has massive old systems." "Maybe," Maya conceded, though it didn't feel like mere unease. It felt focused. "Or," Ben continued gently, "it could be stress. Moving is stressful. Starting fresh in a new space, especially one with a lot of character, can play tricks on your mind. Power of suggestion. You expect an old Foundry to be a bit creepy, so you start feeling creeped out." "It doesn't feel like suggestion," Maya insisted, frustration creeping into her voice. "It's specific. Localized. Look," Ben said kindly, "you're highly sensitive to your environment, it's part of what makes you so good at your job. Maybe you're just picking up on subtle environmental stuff most people wouldn't notice. Get some really good noise-canceling headphones, focus on your work, try to ground yourself. Maybe put up some more art on that wall, break up the space visually. His logical explanations felt simultaneously reasonable and completely inadequate. He was trying to help, trying to anchor her to reality. But his reality didn't include the silent, unwavering gaze that seemed to emanate from the very bones of her apartment. The conversation left her feeling more isolated than ever, the invisible observer her only constant, silent witness. The map of its gaze was etched not just on the walls, but onto her fraying nerves. The phenomenon began to evolve, or perhaps Maya's perception of it sharpened. It wasn't just a static feeling anymore, it seemed subtly reactive. When she was deep in concentration, meticulously editing a difficult audio track near one of the hot spots, the sensation of being watched would intensify, pressing in, as if her focus drew its focus. It was like leaning too close to a silent, invisible entity that leaned back in response. Her emotional state also seemed to influence it. On days when anxiety tightened its grip, a looming deadline, a difficult client, the gaze felt heavier, denser, almost sympathetic? Or was it feeding on the emotional energy? It was impossible to tell. Sadness, a quiet melancholy that sometimes washed over her in the huge, lonely space, seemed to draw a similar weighty presence from the walls. Conversely, when she made a conscious effort to ignore it, projecting indifference, the feeling would sometimes seem to pulse, to lean in with a renewed intensity, as if resisting being dismissed. It was a silent, one-sided conversation where the wall seemed to react to the broadcast of her inner state. This unsettling reactivity began to bleed into her other senses, but only near the hot spots. Sounds behaved strangely. Ambient noise in the room might seem slightly muffled when she stood near the primary brick wall hotspot, yet tiny, almost imperceptible sounds, faint clicks, a dry scraping like settling dust, a soft thump, would seem to originate from within the wall itself. Sounds too subtle for her high-fidelity microphones to reliably capture, yet undeniably present to her hypersensitive ears in those specific locations. Sometimes, especially when tired and facing a watched wall in low light, she'd experience brief flashes of phosphenes, those pinpricks of light behind the eyelids. They danced at the periphery of her vision, vanishing when she turned away from the wall. And accompanying the strongest surges of the watching sensation, a faint, unidentifiable smell would sometimes manifest. It wasn't unpleasant, just odd. A hint of ozone, like after a thunderstorm, mixed with the dry scent of ancient dust and a faint, almost undetectable metallic tang, like old pennies. It lingered for a moment, then dissipated, leaving only the persistent feeling of observation. Seeking any fragment of explanation, Maya struck up a conversation with Mr. Davis, the building superintendent, a man whose age seemed indeterminate, his eyes holding the quiet knowledge of someone who'd seen the Foundry lofts through many seasons. She found him tightening a leaky faucet in the shared laundry room. "Mr. Davis," she began casually, leaning against a washing machine, "this building has so much history. I was curious about its original use." Davis straightened up slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. "Oh, proper Foundry back in the day. Ironworks. Before that, some say textiles, but mostly metal. A noisy, dirty business." He squinted at her. "You're in 3B, right? The big one facing south?" Maya nodded. "It's beautiful, but very solid. Thick walls," he agreed, nodding sagely. "Built to last. And to contain noise, heat. Maybe other things." He paused, a slight twinkle in his eye. They kept a close eye on the workers back then. Foremen had offices with little windows overlooking the floor. Strict schedules, no slacking. He gestured vaguely. "Some parts of this building. Whole sections. They sealed him off decades ago. Cheaper than renovating, I suppose. Or maybe they just didn't want anyone poking around." Maya felt a prickle of unease. "Did anyone unusual ever live in my unit? Before the conversion, or even after?" Davis scratched his chin. Place was derelict for years before the developers came in. But I do recall hearing stories about one of the first tenants in your space, maybe 15, 20 years back. An artist fella, real recluse. Got obsessed with sound, they said. Always complaining about noise nobody else could hear. Rigged up microphones everywhere. Some folks reckoned he went stir crazy in there. Just sat listening. Or maybe," Davis lowered his voice slightly, leaning conspiratorially closer, "maybe he was just watching the walls." He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound, dismissing it as tenant gossip. But his words resonated with Maya's experience. Surveillance. Obsessive listening. Watching the walls. The building's past seemed to echo disturbingly in her present unease. Were these just stories, or did the thick walls retain more than just structural integrity? Did they hold the imprint of past observations, past obsessions, now passively focused on her? The conversation left her with more questions, the metaphorical layers of the walls feeling unnervingly real. Maya's expertise in sound became both a tool and a torment. She started noticing anomalies that defied the building's supposed soundproofing, specifically concentrated around the watched hot spots. Through one section of the thick plaster wall near the sealed chimney breast, a confirmed hotspot, she could sometimes hear conversations from the adjacent apartment with startling clarity. Not entire sentences, but fragments, emotional tones, far clearer than should have been possible through such dense material. Yet, move a few feet along the same wall, away from the hotspot, and the sound vanished into utter, impenetrable silence. It was as if that specific patch acted like an accidental acoustic lens. Conversely, the main brick wall hotspot seemed to create an acoustic shadow. When she played music or spoke near it, the sound felt subtly dampened, less vibrant. She confirmed this with recordings. Audio captured near the hotspot sounded flatter, slightly distorted, with certain frequencies seemingly suppressed, compared to recordings made just a few meters away. The walls weren't just passively holding a presence, they seemed to be actively, if erratically, filtering or focusing sound, or perhaps, filtering awareness itself. The phenomenon wasn't static geographically, either. The hot spots began to subtly shift and expand. The watched area on the main brick wall seemed to creep outwards by inches each week. The feeling near the partition wall in her bedroom intensified, now encompassing the entire corner, making sleep increasingly difficult. She'd wake abruptly in the dead of night, not from a noise, but from the overwhelming certainty that unseen eyes were fixed upon her from the plaster inches from her pillow. The feeling sometimes seemed to follow her as she moved parallel to a specific wall, a slow, invisible tracking that frayed her nerves raw. Her sanctuary was becoming a cage, its bars the invisible beams of focused attention. Ben, hearing the escalating panic in her voice during their calls, insisted on visiting. He arrived on a Saturday afternoon, bringing coffee and a determinedly rational attitude. Maya, desperate for validation, practically dragged him towards the main brick wall hotspot. "Stand here, Ben. Right here," she urged, her voice tight. "Just concentrate. Feel it. It's right there, coming from the wall." Ben stood patiently, hands in his pockets, brow furrowed in concentration. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, looking around the loft. He ran a hand over the cool brick. "Okay, I'm concentrating," he said slowly. "It's a wall, Maya. Maybe slightly cooler here? Could be a draft from somewhere, or just thermal mass." He tilted his head. "I hear the fridge humming. Distant traffic. Nothing unusual." "No, not hearing," Maya insisted, gripping his arm. "Feeling. Like pressure, like focus. Like someone staring." Ben looked at her, his expression shifting from skepticism to genuine concern. "Maya," he said gently, "I feel brick. Maybe a little bit of an old building vibe, you know? Slightly uneven temperature. But I don't feel anything like what you're describing. Nothing watching me." He put a hand on her shoulder. "Are you sleeping okay? Work stress getting to you?" His inability to feel it was devastating. It wasn't just that he didn't believe her, it was that the phenomenon itself was apparently entirely subjective, confined to her perception. It cemented her isolation. Was she truly experiencing something inexplicable, or was her own mind, her sensitivity to her environment, betraying her? The invisible observer remained, its presence undeniable to her, yet non-existent to the outside world. Ben's visit, meant to anchor her, had instead cast her further adrift, making her question her sanity more profoundly than ever before. The walls watched, and only she could feel their gaze. If the phenomenon wasn't perceptible to others, perhaps its source was physical, hidden within the building's anatomy. Maya's focus shifted from the feeling itself to the structure that housed it. Armed with a desperate need for tangible evidence, she plunged into research. Finding original blueprints for a 19th-century foundry proved difficult, but she managed to locate later architectural plans from the loft conversion online. They were frustratingly vague about the original internal structures, hinting at existing partitions and reinforced sections without specifics. So, she turned to direct examination. Armed with a stud finder, a laser measure, and a tapping mallet, she began meticulously mapping her own walls. She discovered inconsistencies the conversion plans hadn't shown. Behind the plaster near the chimney breast hotspot, the stud finder indicated an unusually deep void before hitting solid masonry, suggesting a double wall, perhaps enclosing the old flue, but wider than necessary. Tapping along the main brick wall hotspot produced subtle variations in resonance, hinting at different densities or possibly filled-in openings behind the uniform brick facing. She scraped away a small, inconspicuous patch of modern paint near the baseboard of the brick wall, revealing older layers beneath. Underneath chipped paint, she found thick, horsehair-reinforced plaster adhering directly to the brick in most areas. But in the heart of the hotspot, her scraping revealed a different material entirely, a dense, fibrous board she didn't recognize, dark and almost felt like. Was it some kind of primitive insulation? An early attempt at acoustic dampening? Near another cool spot on a different wall, she pried off an outlet cover. Peering inside with a flashlight, she saw not just modern wiring, but older, fabric-coated cables disappearing into thick metal conduits embedded deep within the plaster, conduits that led nowhere according to the modern electrical plan. Remnants of the building's industrial past, arteries cut off from their purpose, still lurking within the structure. These discoveries fueled her hidden space theory. Could trapped air within these voids be creating localized infrasound pockets, affecting only someone hypersensitive like her? Or was it about the materials themselves? Did that strange fibrous board, or the specific mineral composition of the old bricks in certain areas, somehow absorb and retain residual energy, psychic echoes from the intense activities of the Foundry, the surveillance, the reclusive artist's obsession? Horsehair plaster, old mineral wool, embedded metal, perhaps these elements created unique resonant cavities or acted as strange antennae for ambient psychic energy, focusing it into the palpable sensation she experienced. The investigation offered potential physical explanations, but they felt incomplete, unable to account for the reactive nature of the watching, its seeming connection to her own mental state. Then, one morning, as pale sunlight hit the main brick wall hotspot at a low angle, she saw it. It was incredibly faint, almost subliminal. A subtle discoloration on the brick surface, like a watermark left by drying moisture, or a faint heat signature lingering long after its source was gone. It wasn't dirt or damage, it seemed integral to the bricks themselves. The pattern was amorphous, vaguely oval, roughly coinciding with the area where the feeling was strongest. She touched it. The bricks felt smooth, cool, unchanged. She took photos, but the pattern was too faint to register clearly. Over the next few days, she watched it obsessively. It seemed to subtly shift, not moving across the wall, but altering its internal density, its edges blurring and sharpening slightly. Was the wall itself physically reacting to the unseen presence? Or was it responding to her constant, focused observation? Was this a physical manifestation of the watcher, or a projection of her own fractured perception onto the inert surface? The faint, shifting stain became another layer of the mystery, blurring the line between the architectural and the psychological, the tangible and the spectral. Maya began to perceive not just the presence, but its rhythm, its signature. The feeling wasn't a constant, monolithic pressure, it had fluctuations. It would intensify and recede in slow, rhythmic pulses, almost like breathing. The cold spots detected by the thermal camera weren't static either, they subtly waxed and waned in intensity, mirroring the ebb and flow of the watching sensation. Even the faint, internal wall sounds she occasionally heard, the clicks, the scrapes, started to exhibit recurring patterns when she listened intently for long periods. It felt less like random structural noise or simple residual energy, and more like the rudimentary, idling processes of a non-visual consciousness bound inextricably to the building's fabric. Her research, combined with another carefully steered conversation with Mr. Davis, yielded more specific historical context for her unit. The area encompassing the main brick wall hotspot, Davis recalled from old-timers' tales, had once been the location of the Foundry foreman's elevated office. Small observation windows, long since bricked over flush with the wall, had allowed constant monitoring of the work floor below. The section with the plaster hotspot near the chimney? That corresponded to what used to be a small, isolated storage room where certain sensitive materials or valuable patterns were kept under lock and key, a place of enforced stillness and quiet watchfulness. The reclusive artist tenant Davis had mentioned? Records confirmed he had indeed occupied her unit and had filed numerous bizarre complaints about auditory phenomena before eventually being evicted, leaving behind strange acoustic paneling attempts attached to some walls. The past states of intense observation, prolonged isolation, and focused sensory input seemed directly correlated to the locations where the feeling now manifested most strongly. This understanding shifted Maya's approach. If the phenomenon was tied to past states of focus and reacted to her own mental state, could she influence it more directly? She decided to experiment, treating the wall not as an inert object, but as a passive receiver, maybe even a rudimentary reflector. Standing before the main hotspot, She focused intensely, projecting feelings of fear and anxiety towards the brick, remembering past stressful events, visualizing worst-case scenarios for her current projects. The effect was immediate and unnerving. The watching sensation surged, becoming almost painfully intense, the cold spot radiating a palpable chill, the pressure against her mind increasing dramatically. It was like shouting into a canyon and having the echo return amplified. Then, she tried the opposite. Taking deep breaths, she employed mindfulness techniques learned from anxiety reduction tutorials. She visualized calmness, projected feelings of peace and neutrality towards the wall, consciously emptying her mind of focus, letting her thoughts drift without attachment. Slowly, tentatively, the intense pressure began to recede. The feeling didn't vanish entirely, it remained a low, persistent hum at the edge of her awareness, but the agonizing focus lessened, the psychic volume turned down. It confirmed her terrifying suspicion. The observer wasn't just a passive imprint, it was interactive, resonating with her own psychic and emotional state. It fed on focus, reacted to strong emotion, and could be slightly dampened by projected calm. She wasn't just living in a haunted space, she was in a silent, psychic dialogue with the very structure around her, a structure that seemed to absorb and reflect her own inner world through its unseen, unwavering gaze. The signature wasn't just in the patterns, it was in the interaction itself. The fragile truce achieved through projected calm didn't last. The observer seemed to adapt, or perhaps her ability to maintain mental neutrality simply eroded under the constant, low-level pressure. The watching sensation intensified again, no longer confined to specific hot spots but emanating from multiple walls simultaneously, creating a crossfire of silent observation. The feeling became inescapable, a constant weight on her consciousness. Her thoughts grew muddy, her professional focus shattered. Every moment was spent either actively resisting the feeling or succumbing to the distraction, constantly drawn to the silent, watching surfaces around her. Her sense of self felt thin, porous, slowly dissolving under the relentless, dispassionate scrutiny. She couldn't live like this. The loft wasn't a home, it was a sensory prison cell where the bars were invisible but infinitely more confining. She had to sever the connection, disrupt the phenomenon, or shield herself definitively before she lost herself entirely. Flight was an option, but some part of her, fueled by terror and a desperate need for agency, felt compelled to fight back on her own terms, using her own understanding of the phenomenon. It reacted to focus, to emotion, to sound, or the lack thereof. Her countermeasure had to target these vulnerabilities. Combining her knowledge of acoustics and her recent discoveries about psychic resonance, she formulated a plan, an attempt to soundproof her soul. First, she aimed for sensory overload, rooted in her audio expertise. She wouldn't just play white noise, she would create a dense, chaotic soundscape designed to overwhelm any subtle resonance the observer relied upon. Dragging her best studio monitors into the center of the room, she queued up multiple tracks simultaneously, layers of complex, shifting static frequencies, recordings of industrial machinery, discordant ambient textures, even snippets of human speech chopped and rearranged into nonsense patterns. It was sonic chaos, multi-layered and unpredictable, designed to jam the observer's ability to focus or latch onto her own psychic frequency. Simultaneously, she initiated a mental wall. Sitting cross-legged on the floor amidst the sonic assault, she closed her eyes and employed intense visualization. She imagined a shield of impenetrable silence expanding outwards from her core, a mental fortress repelling the invisible gaze. She focused every ounce of her will on projecting psychic null, refusing to acknowledge the watching sensation, actively denying its existence, starving it of the emotional and attentional energy it seemed to crave. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. As the chaotic soundscape filled the loft and her metal shield solidified, the feeling of being watched didn't just intensify, it lashed out. It felt like a physical blow, a wave of pure, disembodied attention crashing against her mental defenses. The air temperature plummeted rapidly, visible puffs of condensation forming with her breath despite the roaring audio. Objects near the walls began to rattle violently, picture frames vibrated, loose screws buzzed, the metal beams overhead seemed to groan under sudden stress. Her electronic equipment flickered erratically, lights blinking, screens momentarily going dark despite being on a surge protector. The pressure against her mind was immense, agonizing. It felt like the collective weight of every past observation, every moment of focused intensity the building had ever absorbed, was now directed solely at her, trying to breach her defenses, to overwhelm her consciousness. The faint pattern on the brick wall seemed to pulse with a dark, internal light. It wasn't just watching anymore, it was resisting, fighting her attempt to sever the connection with the focused fury of a disturbed, ancient consciousness. Maya squeezed her eyes shut, pouring all her energy into maintaining the sonic chaos and the metal wall, grit teeth against the psychic onslaught, unsure how long she could withstand the observer's silent, furious siege. Then, as abruptly as it began, the assault ceased. The agonizing pressure vanished, snapping away like a stretched rubber band. The rattling stopped. The air temperature slowly began to normalize. The chaotic noise from her speakers continued, but the underlying psychic weight, the feeling of intense, directed observation that had plagued her for months, was gone. Or, not entirely gone, perhaps, more like receded to an almost imperceptible background hum, a faint static so low it could almost be imagined. The immediate, overwhelming presence had been broken. Exhaustion hit Maya like a physical blow. She collapsed back against the floor, limbs trembling, sweat cooling on her skin. The sonic chaos from the speakers now sounded merely loud, not purposeful. She fumbled for the remote, silencing the noise. The resulting quiet felt different, empty, blessedly empty. The oppressive weight was lifted, leaving her mentally raw but finally, blessedly, alone in the room. She didn't spend another night in the loft. The next morning, operating on adrenaline and sheer will, she called her landlord, citing severe, untraceable electrical issues and disturbing structural noises making the unit uninhabitable. She didn't care about the lease or the deposit, she just needed out. Packing was a blur, movers hauling her life away from the place that was supposed to be a sanctuary but had become a meticulously designed torture chamber for her specific sensitivities. She didn't look back as the truck pulled away from the Foundry lofts, leaving the thick walls and their silent secret behind. Months later, Maya was settled in a new apartment. It was aggressively modern, almost sterile, with thin walls in a newly constructed building, the antithesis of the Foundry. She worked almost exclusively with high-end, noise-canceling headphones clamped firmly over her ears, regardless of the ambient noise levels. Her sensitivity remained, perhaps even heightened. She found herself acutely aware of the subtle sounds of her new environment, the feel of different rooms, the pressure of confined spaces. One evening, she was setting up her audio equipment in her new, smaller workspace. Routine task: place a microphone near a wall to capture the room tone, the baseline silence of the space. She knelt, adjusting the mic stand, positioning the sensitive condenser microphone a few inches from the smooth, painted drywall. And she paused. For a fleeting, stomach-churning moment, she thought she felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible echo of that familiar pressure. The ghost of a sensation, like the memory of a phantom limb. That distinct feeling of focused attention, emanating from the other side of the plaster. Was it PTSD, a traumatic echo imprinted on her psyche? Was it her heightened sensitivity playing tricks, forever tuning her into subliminal cues others missed? Or had a tiny fragment of the Foundry's pervasive awareness somehow clung to her, a psychic burr carried away from the source? She squeezed her eyes shut, then opened them. Nothing. Just a plain, boring wall in a plain, boring apartment. She took a deep breath, adjusted the microphone gain, and forced herself to focus on the DAW interface glowing on her laptop screen. Back to work. Back to the controlled world of sound. But now, the silence she recorded always felt different. Less like an absence, and more like something held breathlessly at bay. She was free from the Foundry, but she would forever be listening to the silence, wondering what might be listening back from just beyond the walls. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.